Carliss Chatman. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at Washington and Lee University School of Law in Lexington, Virginia. This week, we're acknowledging the current season to discuss the modern role of the Black church, and I've assembled some experts for what will be an exciting conversation. We have Dr. Monique Moultrie, Pastor Cheryl Moore, and Reverend Stan Williams, and I'll start by having them introduce themselves further. First, Dr. Monique Moultrie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Dr. Monique Moultrie. I'm basically a scholar of religion, race, gender, and sexuality, which just means I primarily work on Black women's sexuality and Christianity. I have just finished a book on Black lesbian religious leaders, and my newest project is on Black child-free women in faith.
Ooh, that's me. I need it.
And me.
Yes. All right, now, Pastor Cheryl.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Carliss. This is awesome. I'm Pastor Cheryl Moore. I'm the senior pastor of the Zion Temple United Church of Christ in Durham, North Carolina. I am a community activist, an advocate, and just an all-around the way girl. Glad to be here and glad to share with you.
Thank you. And finally, last but not least, Stan.
Hey, everybody, Reverend Stanley Williams here. I am the assistant pastor at Zion Temple United Church of Christ in Durham, where Pastor Moore is the senior pastor. I'm glad to be here, and we're going to see what else comes out.
It will be a good conversation. I was going to say sanctified conversation, but I won't claim that because I know myself. I might bring it down a little bit. Y'all are good people. I don't know about me. All right. Now, Monique, I'd love to start with you by discussing what seems to be a trend to me, where people say they're spiritual but not religious. And in your work, you mentioned that you focused on sexuality and Black women's sexuality in general. And I've wondered if you've seen an intersection between your work and the motivation behind your work and the reason why so many younger people say, I'm spiritual, not religious.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the religious polling data says that Gen Z and millennials, so basically 18 to 40, are less likely to attend church, but overwhelmingly believe in God and have spiritual practice. So they may pray, they may chant, but they just don't attend a service anywhere. And this data also says since these are the childbearing age range, their children are also not present. So they're not churched children. So in my interviews with Black women in sexuality, I get a mixture of folks who are Christian plus. So they are folks who are lifelong Baptist members, but they also are IFA practitioners, or they're lifelong this AME, but they are also Buddhists. They chant Buddhist. So I think when we talk about folks who are spiritual but not religious, I think there are different camps. There are those who have problems with institutionalized religion, and so they don't want to claim an identity. They just, I do me, and my spiritual practices, I'm one with God, and that's all that matters. You also have folks who claim that because they're outside of the denominational Christian norm or Muslim, whatever world religious norm, and so they are practicing indigenous religions. And so they really are spiritual. They don't participate in institutionalized. And then I think finally, there are those who are just offended by the institution and think religion should be personal. And so spirituality is what personally they do. So I think around this time of year, we have lots of conversations with folks because this is the, CME time, the Christians who show up for Mother's Day, Easter, and Christmas. And I think that moment neglects the fact that they have practices the rest of the year. Just to say that, are they Christian because they only show up at these times? I think you actually have to listen to what people are telling you.
And I think, what do you think the reasons are behind more people being CME? Because I feel like when I was a kid, we were in church like 3 days a week. It was Sunday all day, choir rehearsal, prayer meeting, youth meeting. Church was like what we did socially, and that seems to not be the case anymore. There really are people who are only there those 3 days a year, if at all. And has your research exposed some reasoning behind this?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are getting their needs met in different places. And so when I talk to folks and they tell me, well, I'm going to show up on Christmas, or I'm going to show up on Easter, I ask them, well, what do you do to make meaning the rest of the year? because I don't want to presume that they don't have a practice. And so lots of folks have real significant ways of making meaning of life, of dealing with the hard times, of finding joy. They don't involve being in a building. And I think what COVID has transformed for a lot of standard church building folks is the idea that you can only be active in a building. I think folks are, in church on their way to the park, or they're in church in various, at brunch, and they're having conversations about what the meaning of life is, and they're having these deep conversations. And so I think we are watching a shift to even the standard traditional Black church in its understanding of what being in church means and what being church means, that allows for more of those expressions.
Now, Cheryl, at Zion Temple, y'all have done a lot in COVID. Like before we even went online, I talked about how I've tuned into Zion Temple, via Facebook sometimes even, right? And so I wondered if you've noticed this trend as well, this trend towards people being spiritual instead of religious, and how has it impacted your ministry and your congregation?
Thanks for the question. And Dr. Moultrie, thank you so much for your response to this question. And I really agree with Dr. Moultrie wholeheartedly. Even before the pandemic, we find specifically with this generation, and for those who espouse a more progressive ideology, that defining oneself as spiritual versus religious really allows you to free yourself from being attached to organized religious groups whose theological perspectives really fail to align with the ideals, beliefs, and personal truths that individuals have, and to divorce themselves from groups who tend to espouse unconditional civil rights. These organized religious groups, even the church, tend to practice selective civil rights or civil rights with conditions. And we know that two of the primary issues are abortion rights and same-sex marriage are two of the prominent issues in organized religious groups, especially the church, in particular, the Black church. And so now we have a group of grassroots leaders who says that the Black church is no longer at the forefront of issues of inequities, social justice issues, and that you can join us, but we don't need you because we are leading now these efforts by way of being activists and advocates in our communities. And so what I believe that this generation is saying to us is that the Black church no longer has the bandwidth or the moral high ground to be in the forefront and to lead as it relates to certain things. So being spiritual now divorces me from the obligation of being connected to and sometimes the tension of being connected to a group who does not espouse fully my ideals, my personal truths, and or my beliefs.
And so with your own congregation, how have you combated that feeling that the younger generation has about the church to maintain community and to maintain the collective that the church gives?
It's interesting. That's not a simple answer. It's interesting. We are a connectional church, yet autonomous because we are a part of the United Church of Christ. Now we know that generally the UCC is welcoming and affirming. So now we're talking specifically about the Black church and being in the South. A lot of the Black UCC churches divorced themselves from the UCC denomination over the issue of same gender loving people. So they may even still carry the tag, the denomination UCC, but they've divorced themselves from the organization in terms of being specifically tied to it and being a part of the organization, right? And so being autonomous, we have really been specifically intentional about teaching and preaching and reaching those who are in marginalized communities, particularly the LGBTQIA+ community, and also being sure that we affirm the gifts and graces that they bring to the table. I believe that we should all be able to bring the fullness of our humanity to the Lord's table, and to not just be welcome, but wholly acceptable. And what I think Black churches have tried to do in mitigating this culture is to say all are welcome, but just because people are welcomed, it doesn't mean that you wholly accept them. And that's what's happening. When you continue to espouse sin language, when you talk about same gender loving people, then you're saying you're welcome, but you're not wholly accepted. Until we divorce ourselves and change our language and fully embrace and affirm the gifts and graces and allow those to be expressed, right? And experienced in our houses of worship, we have a lot of work to do. And I'm still actually plowing that field and trying to do that work in our church and in our community.
Well, and you know, I always think it's interesting. I grew up with no female pastors,
Wow.
right, in my denomination, and so I just, you know, I feel like you being a pastor and a lead pastor of a Black church alone is a big advancement that I think we have to acknowledge that it's a change. It's a major change from even 20 years ago to have you as a senior pastor. So, you know, I applaud the folks at Zion Temple for being that progressive, which shouldn't be progressive, right? To have a woman in charge, but it often is in the Black church. And I feel like it is some of the reason why people have shied away and tried to disconnect. Now, Stan, what do you think is behind this shift? You know, what are your ideas about why people are abandoning religion? And I know you have some ideas, so I'm ready.
You can see it on my face. Totally agree with what Dr. Moultrie, Dr. Monique, you know, has said, what Pastor Moore has said. So many things going on in my head. I think that there are issues where people have a lack of presence, or a lack of power, or a lack of voice. I think there's an issue with a sense of belonging, because a lot of time people go to these places, they go to these churches, they go there because they find people that look like them, that might think like them. And so we're seeing, you know, as Pastor Moore mentioned, intergenerational changes where, like, you know, Big Mama and them, you know, went to church, but then the generation after them dropped folks off at church. And then you got the folks who were dropped off not going to church, you know, and, you know, also mindful that that when we talk about the Black church, or when we talk about the church in general, we're not, we have to live between the tension of talking about the building versus talking about people, you know, the institution, because a lot of our problems are because we're thinking about the building. And people are caught between novelty and nostalgia. You know, whenever people think about the Black church, they're thinking about, oh, Big Mama and, you know, white on first Sunday and people shouting and the fried chicken after, you know, and the funeral home fans. And they're thinking about these nostalgic sorts of things. But we also have to deal with the novelty that, you know, the church is supposed to be a living and breathing thing that God breathes into. And if it's living and breathing like God, it should be moving. And people get caught up in the nostalgia and don't want to move in ways that are real or relevant to what's going on for people. And that, I think, is a huge part of why people are turning away or becoming less involved in the active church, you know, because what they've seen has not been real and what they're seeing has not been relevant, you know, because you can shout all day, but what does it have to do with paying my bills? What does it have to do with keeping my kids safe? What does it have to do with having affordable housing? You know, where is the real? Where is the relevant? You know, I think, and COVID has definitely exposed a lot of that. You know, when things were forced to shut down and people were not allowed in the buildings, then the question is, who is the church then? What's the church going to do without a building? How do you be church without being in these four walls together? And final thing, because I ramble, is that we have to remember that even, I want to talk right about God, because that's a huge thing. God is more focused on relationship than religion. Before there was ever religion, there was relationship, because God was already in relationship with God's self. God was not male. God is not male. God is not female. God said, let us make man in our image, right? So God is already in communion and community and relationship with God's self and creates the world to be in relationship with it. And so another part of the reason that people are divorcing themselves from that experience is because there's a lot of focus on religion, but not on the relationship that you really want. And if you won't really need the religion if you have the relationship. Like the relationship should be undergirding everything. Everything you do should be out of the relationship, not because of the ritual of religion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we kind of jumped the gun in starting this conversation. And so any of you can answer this. And I think, Pastor Cheryl kind of alluded to it. All of you have alluded to like the history and the nostalgia. So I'd love to talk for a minute about what we as Black people have gotten out of the church historically, and why this Black church relationship is different than how other people engage with church. And so anyone can answer, like, what have we gotten historically out of it? And why and it kind of highlights why this shift matters because of what that historical role was. Do you want to take it, Cheryl? You're nodding the most.
Well, sure. I'll start. I think that historically, the Black church has been, number one, not just about the four walls of the church historically, but about being a cornerstone and a voice and an advocate in and for the community at large. Black pastors back in the day did not just pastor a specific church congregation, but that pastor pastored the community. So the community looked up to certain pastors to stand in the gap for underserved persons and marginalized people, specifically in the civil rights era with Dr. King and other pastors who led that group. Now we could talk about the patriarchy and all the other innate systems that have been built in that and that are still perpetuated in our churches today. As you talked about me, in the 132-year history of our church, I am the first woman pastor ever of our church. And that's a grave indictment, I think, against the Black church at large. And we're still fighting that battle that we should not have to fight, right? But I think being a mouthpiece and a cornerstone in our communities is one of the things that we looked up to the Black church to be, and Black pastors in particular, and specifically back then. As you talked about, there weren't any or many women pastors, right? I didn't grow up with the model myself. My father's a pastor, but I did not grow up with the model seeing women lead in the church. They stood on the floor, they led prayer meetings, they did other things. And even if they called themselves a preacher, if they were allowed to preach, it might have been on Women's Day or Mother's Day, and they stood on the floor, not having the opportunity to grace the pulpit to render the message. So, I think that one of the major things that's missing for me when we talk about the modern Black church versus the historical Black church is that we are no longer that cornerstone, that mouthpiece, the leading voice and leading activists in our communities for issues of disparities and inequities and social injustices and on and on and on, the way that we used to be. As difficult as it was then, I think it's much more difficult now for us to be that voice and sort of to regain our positioning. And I don't think that we can. I think that we now have to join the movement that has taken place from grassroots leadership within our communities. And I'm glad to see it.
All right, Monique, would you like to weigh in at all on the historical role?
I just want to say ditto. I think also that it served a purpose for the Black community because it was a Black space, a Black owned space. So it was a place of being affirmed, supposedly, a place of feeling welcome, supposedly. And I think that that's part of the nostalgia that Reverend Stanley was talking about, that, we have this historical memory without the nuances. King, for all of King's greatness and flaws, couldn't get a home in the Black church. He kept, breaking out of those walls. He had to start the Progressive National Baptist Convention because his own Baptist convention was like, nah, we're not feeling none of the stuff you're doing. So I think this nostalgic sense that we have of the church has been this space where you could get, from birth to the tombstone is true, but there are lots of ellipses of where people have fallen out and where their needs haven't been met in those spaces. But I think it has served as a hub.
Right. And, and I kind of wonder if the reason why, we are able to fall out of the church space, even though, probably people like us have always been disgruntled with the church, we just didn't have anywhere else to go, is that now we do have other Black spaces that we can create, right? Either through technology, making the world smaller, and us being able to have community anywhere has made it such that, I don't have to go sit in church and be forced to sit in the back or not sit here or not wear this, or I can't bring my gay best friend, or, all these things that, we used to put up with in the church. We don't have to do that anymore to have community because we can create other Black spaces. And so to that degree, the church has to evolve, right? The church has needed to evolve some. Stan, do you want to weigh in on history a little more before I move forward?
I totally agree with what Dr. Monique and Boss have said. Historically, the church has given a sense of collective and individual identity, and I think that that's really important because that was the place. It was as Pastor said, it was the cornerstone. That's where you learned. That's where you went for education. That's where you went for social issues. That's where you went to socialize. And we're seeing a lot of that work being done by places outside of those four walls.
Yeah, it makes me think about even just the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent movements, and how there would have been a time when a pastor might have started that, right? There might have been a time when, even if that pastor was disgruntled with his own church, that's where the leadership came from, and that's not really where our leadership comes from anymore.
And the tricky part, Carliss, is that even when we think about like the civil rights movement, we think that, it's a misconception to believe that all Black churches were a part of that. Mm-hmm. Because they weren't. But, we want to nostalgically think, oh, the Black church, yeah, they were involved in civil rights movement, but not everybody was. So even then, it's the same sort of tension that we're living with.
Well, and it kind of gets into what, Cheryl was talking about earlier, with abortion rights and gay rights, even with civil rights, there were Black churches that were adamantly opposed to things like integration and adamantly opposed to what was happening in the civil rights movement. And you're correct, it's our nostalgia for the church that makes us say, oh, every church was marching with Dr. King. They were not. They were not. Now, Cheryl, I'd love to talk to you about, looking forward a little bit. Do you think there is a place in the modern Black church for everyone? And if there isn't yet, what kind of things can we do to make it more inclusive?
Sure. There should be a place in the modern Black church for everyone, but we all know that that's not necessarily the truth. I think that one of the grave indictments against the church historically, the Black church historically, and the modern Black church, and it still reigns true, is that she has been guilty of theologically marginalizing her own people by continuing to perpetuate and to espouse a white evangelical brand of theological perspectives as it relates to what is sin. And it really is just a code for excluding those who choose to live in their truth, and that truth is usually outside of the margins of what is an acceptable Westernized societal norm, right? So we've espoused that as a Black church. We perpetuate that. We preach that. Our cultures and our environments and our atmospheres tend to display that. And I think that's, just a sad indictment against our churches and our people. The Black church continues to condemn and to shun those in our communities who bring their gifts and graces to the church. And if I can be honest with you, many of these marginalized groups are in an abusive relationship with the Black church. They take the abuse because of their love for the church and their longing to be welcomed and embraced in a spiritual, religious space, right? I personally take the abuse because of my love for the church. So again, to sort of mitigate the culture, a lot of modern Black churches now will practice toleration by saying, again, we love the sinner, but we hate the sin, right? And that too is an abusive theological perspective. And we have to abolish that sin language when it comes to love, when it comes to same gender loving relationships, in order to be fully welcoming and wholly accepting of all people. Again, you can be welcomed and still not fully accepted. And that's what many people are accepting as what's going to be the norm for their existence in a Black church setting. And that ought not be so. And so I think there are some things that we have to do intentionally. And the first thing is that we have to engage in theological truth telling. If we tell the truth, we are more Paulinian than we are Christian. That the Black church espouses the teaching of Paul more than the words and the actions of Jesus, number one. Number two, we have to engage in the practice of decolonization of our views of the Bible. I think number three, we have to fully adopt the greatest commandment of love. And that alone will abolish some of the abusive and exclusive theologies that many of our Black churches still use as their foundation. I think another thing that we have to do is that we have to actively and visibly be advocates and voices in our communities for marginalized groups. And then finally, we have to invite folks to the table, and we have to openly affirm and confirm some callings and graces and allow them to use them in our congregations and not shy away from that. So I think that those are some of the things that we can begin to do, but you have to have the boldness and the courage to do this work. Trust, you really have to have the boldness and the courage to be about initiating this kind of work, because it ain't for the faint of heart in the Black church.
I feel like Cheryl for president, Cheryl for head pastor, because we need to implement this full agenda. Because you said a whole word when you said Paulinian. I felt that in my spirit. I was like, whew. Like, what did we used to study on Sundays, right? Like, were we reading the red letters?
Absolutely.
Right? Were we? Right? All right. Now, Monique, I'd love to get back to your work on sexuality and some of what's the heart of your work, the concepts of patriarchy and respectability. And I think your answers will build on some of what Pastor Cheryl has said. Do you have suggestions for how the church can move past that history and be more inclusive?
Yeah, I've been thinking and writing about how to get the Black church right for a very long time, because I am a professing Christian and I want to participate in an organization that's not as janky as the Black church sometimes is. So I have a litany of lists, but my top 5 would be, I think there really has to be shifts in leadership. And that's why this last book was on Black lesbian religious leaders, because I really do think we need more visions of what leadership looks like and more ways to pursue inclusive justice and not just us gets what we want. But a lot of my work is with Black women, which make up the majority of Black congregations. So the reality is we don't get different leadership until we decolonize Black women's minds, because they are the stumbling blocks to acceptance of new leadership. When we say we want to bring in more LGBTQ folks, we want to love the kids in our community that are LGBTQ. If the women who are in those spaces don't take that mantle up, it's not going to get done. So for as much as we talk about the patriarchy, I also talk about the internal patriarchy that Black women in Black church spaces tend to work from, where they assume male leadership is better for them. I also think that tapping into the gifts of our youth is something that we miss out on, that a lot of the reasons why they get dropped off and then they don't come is that they never see themselves reflected. You might have a youth church or you might have a youth Sunday, but if they're not integrally, involved, if they don't understand why the church does what it does, they have no involvement in it, and they're not going to stay because it's not for them. It's something for Big Mama and my aunties, but it isn't for them. I think for congregations, as Blacks have done better and been able to move out of like urban Black spaces where we live together and thus we worship together, when our churches started becoming geographically further away, we have like religious deserts now, where you have a church that is 34 miles away from your home, and you're commuting with people who are coming from 34 other miles, and we've got competing interests. I might be inner city and my interests are affordable housing. You might be talking about the stock market crashing. And I think churches, in order to find a middle ground, have taken these really safe prosperity gospel, like God wants us all to be abundant, like middle ground messages that is supposed to catch everyone, but it doesn't deal with the real. Like, I really am talking about I'm ready to retire. Like, I care that the stock market is tanking, or I really can't afford housing. I want to, hear a sermon that's going to talk about what we're going to do. And so I think that those spaces where we mismatch each other in an effort to all be one community is also a problem in how the church can become more inclusive. And then lastly, the last thing I'll say is that I think if we are social justice oriented, which is what we're seeing more people needing, then we have to do that with the mindset that we're all a body of believers that are trying to please God and trying to live right. And if that's the case, then we have to think about how we all can do that, not just, what's my personal salvation like, but what's it going to take for all of us to thrive. I can't survive if you're not thriving as well. So I think that's the last thing I would pitch in my laundry list of let's fix it quick.
I just love that y'all both had lists. Y'all were like, oh, I got this. Y'all were like, no, I have solutions. Here's what's wrong. And I appreciate that. And I think, to me, the intersection between what Pastor Cheryl said and Dr. Monique said is this prosperity gospel, white evangelical approach, and this focus on sin, which I personally view to be extremely capitalist, right? It's a capitalist way of thinking about religion. Right? Like, it is your fault that you are poor because you are a sinner. It is your fault that you are not prosperous because you're a sinner. It's your fault that you are not cisgendered and straight because you are a sinner. And it's very, it's disconnected from the community. And I often wonder, how long can we embrace capitalism and actually embrace religion and true religion of what we're all talking about? Because you can't just assume that everyone's going to be a millionaire someday. And if they're not a millionaire, they're a sinner. That doesn't work. It just doesn't. Now, Stan, I'd love to transition to you and talk about what you have spoken about frequently, which is the need for religious imagination. And I would love for you to tell us about that idea, why you think it's needed, and how that can help to make the church a more inclusive and welcoming place.
Okay, catch my breath. So before we get into that, can we just take a moment to recognize that this discussion about the Black church is being done majority by Black women? Like, that's huge. Like, for the Black church itself, where the face might be Black male, the hands and the feet and the heart of it, as Dr. Monique said, had been women. And so, just coming off top, first thing about this imagination, I would not call it religious imagination. I'd like to think of it more as a reclaimed or redeemed imagination, because scripture talks about, people not knowing God or thinking that they knew God, but they have these vain imaginations and all their heart they did was evil. And, it talks about the weapons of our warfare, not being carnal, but mighty through God to pull down strongholds, right? And casting out every vain imagination that exalts itself, against the knowledge of God, these strong opinions, that exalt themselves. And so, misogynoir is a vain imagination. Whiteness is a vain imagination. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you perceive Black women in the church only as maybe ministers and that they can cook you some fried chicken or sing you a song to make you shout, if they're minstrels, if they are mules, if they're only martyrs, if they can be mamas and mammies, but they can't be actual messengers of the word of God, when Mary, a woman, was a literal word bearer and bore Jesus, when Mary Magdalene was the first person at the tomb and the first person to carry the good news away from it because the fellas went home scared, like that's a vain imagination. We've got to conquer that. We've got to dismiss that. We have to confront that. So that's the kind of thing that's at the heart of my work. Like if there are vain imaginations, there has to be a pure, a redeemed, a reclaimed imagination that's a gift from God, just like free will is a gift from God. Imposter syndrome is a vain imagination because it says, it's exalting itself against how God sees you. If God created you and God looks at you and sees something not only good, but great and lovable and worth redeeming, like how dare we listen to these voices that would diminish and refute what God says about us, And that's a personal struggle for myself. So I'm talking to myself about that, Tolerance is a vain imagination. Like in these terms, like people, we've talked about tolerance and acceptance, but that bar is too low because there's nowhere in scripture that it talks about tolerating people. We are required to love people, not even embrace. So it's like tolerance, acceptance, embracing, loving, and the bar is love. But we're so twisted. We've listened so much to these vain imaginations that we will settle for acceptance. We'll settle for these half identities where parts of us are accepted. Oh, we'll let them play in the church as long as they don't bring their lover that we don't want to recognize. Oh, like we don't mind that he's got a sweetheart and a wife, because he preaches real good. So these are vain imaginations that we have to deal with, that we have to confront. And that's a huge part of what I'm thinking about in this work that I have not fully written out yet. But like there has to be so much more. Because if the church, first of all, also has to acknowledge that there's a lot of hurt that's happened through the people of the church onto others. Like we don't want to acknowledge that. We don't want to admit that. So then we can't repent and we can't change it and amend it and make it right. And so the church has to heal from the hurt and it has to help others heal, because the calling is not just to be healed, but to be whole. And if we're really going to move forward and we're really going to make an impact, we have to embrace the wholeness, the whole identity of people, not just the parts that we like.
This makes me think of what Monique said when she talked about, it's one thing to bring in female leadership, but we can't move forward until we decolonize our minds, right? And your vain imaginations is how we have colonized our minds to accept male-only leadership, to accept men taking credit for women's work, to accept, it's totally cool if the choir director is gay as long as he doesn't act too gay, right? All of these things that we have accepted is us colonizing ourselves and not being properly on the right path. I'd love to give y'all an opportunity to respond to each other, right? Because I feel like, y'all have been nodding like I have, and I'm the only one talking. So, Cheryl or Monique, if y'all would like to respond to what Stan said or what anyone else said, you can go ahead, Cheryl.
I think Dr. Monique and Pastor Stan, thank you so much for that. I think that one of the greatest gifts that we have been given is the gift of imagination and reimagining ourselves, reimagining the spaces that we curate and that we are engaged with, particularly the church. So thank you for that. Dr. Monique said something that struck me, and she talked about how we have espoused salvation as being personal, when salvation is not personal, it's not individual, it's communal. For God so loved the world. Jesus said, I came into this world not to condemn the world, but that the world through me might be saved. Salvation was never meant to be about personal piety, right? Never. And again, that's that whitewashed, white evangelical lens through which we view the Bible and then live out the principles of salvation in our communities. And so then it creates a hierarchy of Christian life and living, or a hierarchy of salvation, wherein I believe that I'm better than you because I don't do that, right? We all do something, right? And that was never supposed to be the case. But specifically in the Black church, we have espoused that. We perpetuate that type of hierarchical salvation that is impossible to live up to. And you're always trying to live up to that standard, which is a vain imagination. It doesn't exist. I believe that, it's erroneous to think that slave masters taught us Christianity. They did not. We brought it with us. We had our brand, we had our beliefs. We knew about God, we knew about scriptures, right? But they perpetuated and created a different lens through which we should see it, view it, and live it, so that now it's about personal piety. And when I mess up, I'm going to hell or I get punished. And that's been certainly literally beaten into us so much during that period of time that is still ingrained in our DNA as the Black community. And we still live our lives and even live out our relationship with God and specifically Christianity based on that kind of personal salvation when it's supposed to be communal. And when we see it and we live it as community, as communal, then we begin to see that the community is diverse. And then we begin to embrace that diversity by loving the diversity and what everyone brings to the table, and wholly accepting that because we believe in the fullness of the ethic of love, because we are community and the community is one, right? The community is one, but the community is also diverse, and that diversity is beautiful and necessary.
Ooh, I love y'all.
That's a word.
Yes, that's a whole word. Monique?
I think for me, I want the two of them to put together a Christian curriculum like tomorrow, because I teach vacation Bible school, I teach Sunday school, and the vain imaginations is exactly what we're learning. I mean, if you look at any standard Baptist Sunday school education model, that's all they're giving us. And you're absolutely right. It's, all the words of Paul and like how we live our lives under that rubric. And I'm just frustrated because this is what I got when I was 8. And, as I approach 50, I'm like, I just got to know that there's more to the text than this. So I affirm, y'all both get sabbatical so y'all can go write this. We need this tomorrow. Don't just share it with the UCCs. Like, all of us need it.
Yeah, because
yeah. Go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, totally wholeheartedly agree with that. Because one of the things that I think Carliss, she definitely wanted me to talk about this after I posted it on Facebook, but just thinking about what Pastor Moore said about not only our relationship with God, but our relationship with others, because, cross is both. We have to imagine more, that there's a place beyond. Like we've always been talking about getting from here to there, but it doesn't just stop there. God is always calling us to this place called beyond. We're going beyond healing to a place called wholeness, because whenever Jesus healed somebody, it wasn't just to make their body physically better, but Jesus also reconnected them back in the community. Look at the person that was sitting in the tombs, right? Cutting themselves, right? They're divorced from community, they live in a space that's unclean, where they're cut off from their community. Woman with the issue of blood, she's cut off from community. She gave all that she has, she can't be around people because of what the rules and the ritual have said and what they say about her. But Jesus touches her and heals her and makes her whole so that she is reintegrated back into community. That's a huge indictment on us. Think about the widow at Nain. She's already a widow. She loses her son. She's walking him out to the grave, because her life is ending there. Like, that's it for her. She has no connection to community, but Jesus stops the funeral, gives her back her son and her place in community. And we have to imagine that even in the way we relate to each other, we've got to imagine beyond. Because as I wrote, we have to imagine pure imagination, as I like to call it, because I love Willy Wonka. Pure imagination is imagining that God's place and position for our enemies in our lives is more than just being our footstool. Because we hear all the time about our haters and our enemies, and people love to preach about that. God bless them. But your enemy is not always meant to be your enemy. Like, it just might be that God has placed them in your life so that through you, they can learn about themselves and about God and God's love and God's grace. Because that's what happens with the children of Israel in Egypt. He tells Moses, I'm going to get glory out of this. Well, I should say God tells Moses, not he, because God is not male. God tells Moses, there's going to be glory out of this, and I'm doing this so not only does Israel know who I am, but these people in this country know who I am. So we've got to imagine that there's a place in community, even for our enemies. What does that look like? They might not forever be our enemies.
Some of us need enemies.
Oh.
Some folks need it.
Salah.
Right? I mean, who are you without, like, that's your foil, right? For so many people, it's like, I feel the same way about prosperity gospel, right? Like, someone has to be at the bottom for you to be prosperous. Someone has to be your enemy so that you're the good person, right? And, what does the world look like for people who need someone to be lesser to feel whole? I don't know. All right, so Stan, I want to start our last segment with you and kind of speculate on what the future holds. After you and Cheryl go write this curriculum that Monique and I need you to write today, like take some time off, go write this curriculum so Monique can have it for Vacation Bible School this summer. And so I can just have it for my life. Outside of y'all writing this curriculum, what does the future hold? Like, what can we do, like, in the short term to start to find our way back to the Black church and start to rebuild this community?
Ooh, that's a lot. First off, I don't know, and I don't think that it's for people to find their way back to the Black church. I think that the Black church is going to have to find its way to people. As Pastor Moore and Dr. Monique have mentioned, there are grassroots orgs that are doing the work. And so the Black church is going to have to try and catch up and connect and do that work. And they're going to have to live with these orgs not necessarily wanting their involvement or knowing that they don't need their involvement to get this work done. Again, it comes down to being real and relevant. The relevance, as we talked about, is like, how do we help our communities deal with food insecurity? How do we deal with problems in schools? How do we deal with an aging elderly community? Like, our cohort is getting older and they're living longer than ever. And we're seeing, even in health, issues that we've not seen before. And definitely the stuff that we've not talked about. Like, when was the last time that, a church or an org has really talked about what it means and what it looks like to gracefully age? What it means to, to expect that, to help us through these life changes. We're doing it, we're experiencing it. People are living and they're getting older, but who's talking about what that means, And so the relevance is going to be the Black church having to find ways to be relevant and consistent about it. And then they're also going to have to work on being real, authentic, owning up to the good and the bad and the ugly, working to do something different about that, being a consistent presence in the community, showing up, speaking out, especially for those that are marginalized or disenfranchised. And sometimes that even means getting up from the tables where other folks that you would speak for aren't allowed. You're not allowed to go to every table. Don't eat at every table. Sometimes it means getting up from that table.
Well, and one thing we hadn't touched on, is the impact of mass incarceration on the church population and, on people being raised by the grandparents, and that being a reason for this generational gap where, there are people who are, people my parents' age and our parents' age. There aren't many of them in the church when you look at things like the drug epidemic and mass incarceration. There is a generational gap of people who died younger, but then our grandparents lived longer. And so there's this, this kind of wedge. And I think that has had a major impact on the church as well. There's a big generational gap where lots of people the age of my friends' kids, maybe more people our age, but maybe not as many people our parents' age in that 60s, 70s range as there might have been when we were growing up, but lots of people in their 80s and 90s. Or I shouldn't say lots, but more than one would expect with the population. And so I think that has definitely had an impact on the church. Now, Cheryl, what do you think about the future? What's your speculation?
Woo. Stan said a mouthful, and I think some of the things that we talked about in terms of what we can do to be more inclusive, and he's right, that the church is busy trying to bring the community into the church, but we've got to get the church back out into the community. I think the first thing that we have to do is repent. I think the second thing that we have to do is reimagine. And then I think the third thing we have to do after we reimagine is to reach out. Again, the church, through its theological views and perspectives, is totally guilty of being capitalist with the prosperity gospel and other pieces. We've made it a hierarchical institution in terms of the way that we relate to one another and our relationship to and with God, and what that means. And I think we have to change that. It's all about, my happiness, my peace, my joy, my this, my that. And when disciples asked Jesus, listen, teach us how to pray, he said, well, you start off by saying, our Father. It's community. It's all about us, not about you and not about me. But we've made it so individualized. I got mine, you got yours to get, and you ain't got yours because you ain't got enough faith. And if you do this and you do that, I mean, we've made God out to be a cosmic genie. And he's not our cosmic genie, right? And so until we learn that we really are community, a diverse community, but we are one, and we have to take church back out into the community and be a part of community. I don't think anything's going to change. I do believe that the pandemic, again, has exposed a lot, but I don't know if we've learned a lot. I see us falling right back into the same old patterns and ways of being as the church. And we had a grand opportunity over these past 2 years to really rethink some things, to reimagine, to repent, and really do some work in order to come out of this a changed institution and back out into the community. So, I'm optimistic guardedly, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. And as Jesus said, the vineyard is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Where are those courageous, bold laborers who's willing to get out there and to really do this work? And I'm looking to lock arms with those people.
All right, now, Monique, I'll let you close us out with your response about the future. What do you think the future holds?
I think Reverend Stan is right. The church has to evolve and move to where people are, but I think it can't do that without acknowledging that there will be conflict. That I think Black churches need to stop avoiding conflict. That's why we don't talk about sexuality, why we don't talk about patriarchy, because there will be conflict. The early church had conflict. Paul and Barnabas, split all the way up. And, if the early church had conflict and survived thousands of years, I think our, small congregations can do the same. So I think leaning into that conflict to get to the other side is where I hope the future of the Black church will be.
Now, before we leave, I want you all to promote yourselves. You've all been very humble. Monique has 2 books with Duke University Press. So Monique, tell us where we can find your books and what your books are.
Passionate and Pious, Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality, Duke Press, Amazon. And the next one that's coming out is Hidden Histories, Black Lesbian Faith Leadership. And that one will be out either November or December of this year.
And both Duke University Press, both available on Amazon. You need to go buy it if you have enjoyed listening to Dr. Monique today. And then Cheryl and Stan, how do we find and support Zion Temple from afar?
Well, we're in Durham, North Carolina, located there. We will be reopening soon, but you can find us on all social media outlets at Zion Temple UCC on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. I'm working on my first book entitled The Repurposed Life. So that'll be coming out soon. And we're out here.
Just Zion Temple, ZT, look for it, support it. And then Stan owes us a book about his, you need to get that done, bruh. We're all waiting.
I'm working on it, I promise. I'm working on it.
We're all ready. Well, I just want to thank these guests. I feel enlightened and inspired and, ready to move forward. So I appreciate y'all enriching my Holy Week. And I think everyone listening will feel the same. So greatly, greatly appreciated. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to Getting Common today. If you ever miss an episode, you can catch the rebroadcast anywhere podcasts are played, Apple, Spotify, also on the Voice America website. And we also have a YouTube channel where we upload these videos. Feel free to send me emails through the show page, and you can reach out to me on social media as well. I am at Carliss C on all platforms. Thank you very much for listening.